Yu-Gi-Oh! Throughout most of its history would introduce a new summoning mechanic with each new entry to the franchise. And with each new mechanic, there would always be a crowd that claimed said new mechanic ruined the game. This happened with Synchros, XEs, especially Pendulum and Lynx. After Lynx, we haven't gotten a new mechanic since, and that's honestly for the best. Now that the time of hysteria over change has passed, can we definitively say these mechanics ruined the game? Of course not. Well... Pendulum was a bold attempt to get newer players interested in the game. Well, you can special summon a bunch of monsters at once, and they all come back your next turn, so there's always a chance to swing things back around? And it's not another extra deck mechanic, so it should be easy to learn, right? If only. Pepe happens, and then the mechanic's reputation is damaged forever. Master Rule 4 happens, and the mechanic is damaged forever. Great. Konami decides to slaughter Pendulum for their own sins. This attempt to widen the audience of the game backfired. They made the intricacies of the mechanic far too fickle for people to easily grasp. It's likely the reason they go out of their way to suppress Pendulum so no players won't have to engage with it. So how do we get more players this time? Make the most generic summoning mechanic so any person with a functioning brainstem can learn it. This mechanic made the current perceived issues with the game even worse. So you know what Konami did? Make rush duels, of course. The literal philosophy of it is what Pendulum was supposed to be. Summoning a bunch of cards in one turn, drawing until you have 5, there's always the chance to come back. But this has left the TCG in this weird sort of limbo. These two mechanics that made the game too complex for most people have had little to nothing done to better acclimate newer players to them. At this point in the video, I can't sit here and pretend I'm actually glad links exist. I genuinely think this is the one mechanic in the game that, were it to be erased, it would be a genuine improvement. Let's just say it's very apparent why links have the most banned cards of any extra deck mechanic. It was a horrible shift in design philosophy of the game and created a blatant issue for newer players, as well as a slew of retroactive design inconveniences. What does every single new player experience complain about? 37-minute combos that just go on forever. Billion negates. This perception of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is almost entirely manufactured and enabled by the existence of links. Obviously, erasing links won't get rid of this problem entirely, but it'll prevent it from being as widespread. Before I really dig into links itself, it's best to explain what led to them as a concept. Yu-Gi-Oh! Has always been about pulling off combos, the difference from now and back then being consistency. There are a number of cool card interactions and combos that you can pull off, but they were interactions you would see 1 in every 1,000 duels with the card design of the time. This is because you couldn't search all the pieces in the combo, so you just had to draw into them. This issue was apparent out of the gate with the original concept of fusions, perhaps being the most worthless mechanic in any game. Other than fusions being outright bad, they had the consistency of spoiled milk. This was the best fusion, and it still wasn't playable. Eventually, as archetypes became a more prevalent design concept for the game, how to make consistent win conditions became more and more clear. Elemental Hero Stratos was a card that changed things forever. It turns out making an archetypal monster that can search any other archetypal monster is crucial to making a deck's game plan more consistent. Who'da thunk? This being said, Stratos was punished because he was evidently too far ahead of his time. After Stratos, it seemed as though Konami was afraid of crossing a certain threshold around consistency. A fear they no longer have at all. With all that said, you still had to draw Stratos himself or Rhoda, a generic search spell for warriors that would be semi-limited immediately in the TCG. Then bounce all around the list until Konami finally decided it should be at 1 for good. The introduction of synchro monsters inherently called for more consistency. You need a tuner and a non-tuner on the field to make them, so this calls for you being capable of getting 2 semi-specific cards on the field. XEs would then call for 2 or more monsters of a specific level. These cards were generic, but had mechanical restrictions. With Synchros, the monsters used for the summon had to total the Synchro monsters. For XEs, monsters of the same level would create a rank equal to their level. They were generic enough you could hypothetically play them in anything, but not generic enough that every single deck would make them all the time, if at all. Pendulums as a mechanic tried to bring everything together, being able to more easily get a bunch of high-level cards to the field for bigger XCs, get tuners and non-tuners on field in one go for a synchro. Unfortunately, Konami and players soon realized Pendulum only really worked well with itself. Pendulum summon now, they proclaim on a product with 2 unsearchable pendulum monsters and nothing else. The only way to consistently get scales was to be playing a deck full of them. Even then, you could still end up breaking on only high or low. Then once Konami started printing scale searchers, it finally found footing. Too bad it stomped a little too hard with that footing. Pendulum also posed another predicament. Since pendulums are literally 2 different cards, they would have to concentrate all the text into one box and not both, lest they risk Yugi Boomers citing a card other than these 2 as the definitive reason the game is dead. During the Pendulum era, the game had become bloated with just how many monsters you could summon, so Konami thought it would be a great idea to make the next new mechanic slow that down. Gone are the dedicated Pendulum zones, now they just take up 2 of your spell and trap zones. Surely this redesign will have no lasting repercussions. Now you had to have link arrows pointing to zones for any extra deck monsters to be summoned outside of the new EMZ. While you could only use one EMZ, you could entirely lock your opponent out of being able to use the other through U-linking. What a wonderfully designed mechanic. Wouldn't it be a genius idea to make the most generic summoning mechanic have near zero checks and balances to its design? Surely that'll slow the game down. We'll just gut the last mechanic. People can't stand the concept of 1 card actually being 2, so let's make a mechanic where any 2 cards are actually 1,000 cards. This is all not even to mention the logistic nightmare Links brought about. You had to play Links, so an archetype like Burning Abyss that can't function without a link actively needed a link to work. Was he okay? Wait, he became Farfa during this? Is he okay? You couldn't reasonably look at the 10,000 plus card pool and think, yeah, we'll eventually print a link for all of them so you can still play them. Thankfully, Konami walked this aspect back, but this genuinely cemented links as the only mechanic to actively damage the game. You could argue the game revolved around every new mechanic back in its heyday, but you were still allowed to play with the old mechanics, even if they were power crap. Links actively prevented that aspect of player expression, forcing everyone to play them. Even with Master Rule 4 walked back, Pendulum still had to abide by its restrictions. The existence of links had mechanically warped the game irreparably, shifting from consistency to full-blown homogeneity. What led to this utter lack of restraint in design with links? Whoever fucking thought this was a good idea? I don't think it's out of reason to say Zodiac was Konami laying the blueprint for links as a mechanic. A deck wherein any card in the deck is full combo. Surely stacking all these cards will not be a problem in the future. Because of course, ignoring how a mechanic works fundamentally is a great design concept that definitely doesn't strip meaning from the mechanic. Whatever, it's only an archetype, they can have that be their gimmick. But this solidified the design going forward. Links would go far past the limits of consistency and be fully homogeneous. You could say this was a net benefit, seeing as any deck could theoretically compete as long as they can get multiple monsters on field, but this neglects the fact that the deck's identity will be boiled down to a worse version of an already existing deck. This is the point of no return. Well, surely we can balance the game around homogeneity. All we have to do is make the cards bad, and then it's okay they're generic. It really didn't take them long to just fucking give up on balancing, did it? Any 2 monsters are functionally MST, or Raigeki Break for special summon monsters. Any 3 let you shuffle an opponent's card back. These effects being easily accessible subsequently causes the demand of card design to be more resilient. Back row has to have absurd protection. Because this asshole exists, we have to deal with this affront to God. Speaking of godless abominations, we can make this one with 4. How do we balance this Link 1? Give it a fusion card frame, of course. Links were a mistake. I had to just gradually tolerate and accept it at a point. Hell, there are numerous Link-focused decks I love. Evil Twins. Getting the Evil Twins in rotation to use as an interaction. Feels like it's designed in a way that justifies Links being a mechanic. I love World Legacy, finding a way to make use of vanilla cards in a way that only Links could. Sprite is probably my all-time favorite tiered strategy, how it makes level Link and rank 2 monsters into a playstyle. The fact that every time I see a level 2 monster now, my first thought is, how can this be used in Sprite? The fact that Sprite has perfect synergy with the evil twin Links and makes them so satisfying to play. I love Tenyi! Once again, using Link climbing and non-effect monsters as a unique playstyle that other mechanics can't. These are where I think Link shine. While I fucking hate Sky Striker and everything it stands for, I can admit that it's at least a deck that utilizes a playstyle gimmick that's entirely unique to Link's as a mechanic, and I can respect that aspect of the deck. Even with all my praise, I still think Link's are the only mechanic to genuinely fundamentally damage the game. Every mechanic before it had a restriction that affected deck building. Links were designed to both be generic and consistent without demanding many, if any, restrictions in deck building. There's no greater example of this being an issue than with Orcust. Any deck that could get 2 monsters on board was entirely capable of going full Orcust combo because of these hell spawns. Links also led to zone placement becoming a relevant mechanic. No longer just a choice, you have to manage your zones for co-linking and linking in general, which can be extremely tedious. Not only do you have to learn a deck's combo lines and plays, you also have to constantly be aware of your zone placements. Just what the game needed. More tedious bullshit to keep track of. This is textbook slow play if I've ever seen it. What is he even thinking about? What zone to place it in? Oh. The risk of being sacked by cards like Anima or Geonator, while they aren't nearly a common occurrence, a sack is a sack. The fact cards like this exist just creates more needless consideration that can distract from the actual skill-oriented decision-making and lead to more slow play. Another aspect of Links I've neglected to speak about until now is Link climbing. Using an existing Link monster to functionally foot more of the cost of a higher rated Link monster. This is just synchro climbing with a Farfa accessibility setting, which creates an issue that synchro summoning didn't. You see, any tuner that was remotely good was slaughtered at the stake simply because Hulk existed. May you burn in hell for all eternity. Your second effect will be missed by me, and only me, because no one else read that shit. Any monster and a tuner made Hulk, which in turn would summon any tuner from the deck. The list of tuners that enabled synchro climbing, a niche mechanic, had now become cards on Konami's most wanted list. Now any tuner that could cycle itself back meant Hulk got you any generic Link 3 and 4. Love Leader was a little guy that was fun to play with in synchro strategies, but now he became infinite Link material. In other words, the homogeneity of Links was now limiting card design from a fundamental level, actively getting in the way of other mechanics. It made cards that generated tokens go from worthless to banned. Links are the reason why so many cards nowadays have to lock you into specific summons, because if left unchecked, it'll get degenerate plenty fast. And of course they can't just write a lock out of Link summons, as that'd be an admission of guilt. Konami also refuses to write cards with the language of telling you what you're locked out of, and rather what you're locked into. For example, Harmonic Synchro Fusion states that you can only fusion and synchro summon that turn. This means cards would have to list every extra deck mechanic except Link. Instead we get shit like this. You really printed this card during the Link era, huh? Just call me a slur at this point. It'd be less offensive. Speaking of offensive, Boral Sword Dragon is a card people wanted banned because it was a generic OTK you could put in any deck. No one plays this card anymore. Why would they when updated and access code is just better? If you think update is the problem, I would like you to assess why Boral Sword isn't played over access. Boral Sword still required you to contest monsters in battle or with other removal. Access leaves nothing to contest him. The problem isn't that he can attack twice, it's the fact that he can't be responded to. And I don't think Konami is willing to ban another Yusaku boss monster, especially since this one has story significance. Do not let this man go past Link 3. Speaking of going past Link 3, Konami doesn't know how to do that well. If you look at the catalog of Links past 3, they generally tend to fall under 3 specific camps: unplayable, broken, or degenerate. This was the most insulting card ever printed. Thank God they didn't actually call it the Crimson Dragon and gave us the real deal. Ignore this. This is the Crimson Dragon's intended purpose. When I refer to these cards as unplayable, it's either because they're underwhelming for the effort required to make them, or the fact that just making any of the generic broken links would not only always be a better decision, but also possible. This isn't the case in a deck like Sprite because they lock you into 2s so they can't access 3s and up. This forced Konami to actually design good cards under that context, making Sprite as a deck feel more unique, as it couldn't just make Access or Apo, but proved it was plenty strong without them. Broken cards being the dipshit duo that I just mentioned, the existence of these 2 as generic links only encourages unhealthy game states. Access Code is functionally an extra deck super poly that also kills you. Appaloosa prevents you from being able to use 2 to 4 monster effects, negating them. What wonderful and healthy card design. In a game where each monster's effects do so much independently, being able to negate multiple is devastating for any deck that isn't an outright tier 0 strategy. Ergo, a deck that in itself is far ahead of the curve. Are you seeing the issue here? In order to play past these broken cards, you then in turn need a higher density of broken cards. This very obviously isn't healthy for a game environment. These cards should be banned because of what they represent for the game. To that effect, you could also add Avramax to the ban pile. I love this card, but even I have to admit it's kind of bullshit. Believe it or not, I don't think it's healthy for the game to have a generic monster that demands you to have a form of non-targeting removal. It only causes a demand for far more of those cards, which in turn only makes all the targeting removal grow more and more useless than it already is. Of course, we can't forget to talk about pre-errata Firewall. This asshole was a mistake and Konami knew it. They couldn't just up and ban an ace monster, so they gave Yusaku a new one so they could ban it. They eventually decided to just errata it and free it, but Konami is very clearly hesitant to errata cards, because it means wasting a potential card slot in a product for a card that will knowingly be worse and therefore likely undesirable. If only there were a way to errata a broken card to be good instead of bad. But I guess we'll never know what that could possibly look like. Then we have the actively degenerate stuff. Why does Goki have 4 Link 4s when Power Load is the only one worth summoning? Saryuja is a card that in isolation seems fine, but anytime I ever see this card used, it's always for something completely unethical. Zealantis is a war criminal. Skill drain. There are a collection of Link 4s that are good in the context of their actual decks, Shreg, Trouble Sunny being 2 of the best examples, which is how they should be designed, but that's the problem with links. If they're too generically good, any deck that is generally powerful inherently has access to all these broken cards. Like, Shreg isn't super strong without Revolt exactly, because that means hard making a Link 4 on your turn into an opponent's established field, meaning they can likely prevent you from getting to Shreg. Trouble Sunny requires you to play a live twin deck without Sprite, or restricting her to only be summoned on turn 3 or 4, with the process of making her normally meaning losing to Nibiru on the spot, unless there's a secret line I don't know about. She also gives you a piece of non-targeting non-destruction removal that requires you have an evil twin on the field or the useless brick in your hand or deck, so she can't just be tucked in with any card that can dump her from the extra. While earlier I included 5s, they're actually hard enough to summon that it's more acceptable for them to be busted. The cost is restrictive enough that not every deck is capable of just shitting out a Borderland. Same goes with the only Link 6s in the game. Although I'm pretty sure Terahertz is unfortunately just going to always be the end goal of any Cybers archetype in the future. Underworld Goddess, I'm more mixed on. I do think it's cool that there's a card that gives a generic out to any monster, with it requiring you to be able to still output a ton of field presence for the payoff. I don't think an even more generic form of Mecha Fleet is necessarily a very healthy thing down the line, especially now that we're printing support for her. After walking back the mistake of Master 04, Konami decided that Pendulum specifically weren't allowed to go back to normal. Because of the issue Link's now posed for the mechanic, Pendulum couldn't be able to summon a ton of guys from the extra because the amount of subsequent Link summoning would be insane, making Links more of a tumor than an actual supplemental mechanic. Can you tell me what a Pendulum field looks like? That's right, a billion negates. You know whose fault that is? I didn't mention it earlier, but the ability to just link off cards just to get them into the grave is massively game warping. The fact that you can link off Absolute and it floats into Vortex so easily is just, why did we make this design choice? Every pendulum archetype is forced to end with cards that do nothing or build a billion negates, because what else are they gonna do? Konami's design principle for pendulums only encourages long dumb fuck combos, rather than actually having pendulum monsters themselves interact with the game state. Stop fucking doing this. You made extra deck pendulums a thing. Why aren't you utilizing that as their playstyle gimmick? What's the point of them even being pendulums? You entirely refuse to engage with the concept of scaling them, so why even print them? The only utility an extra deck pendulum has gotten is this dumb fuck pack filler, because it has the stat line condition for the Zark trap. Do more than this. It's no secret Konami has a clear disdain for pendulum as a whole, going so far as to print out random out-of-place pendulum and boojins and say, this is the villain. I'm sure that was just a coincidence and design choice. Just like I'm sure all these little pendulum hate crimes were just a coincidence. I made this image when I first started writing the script for this video. They keep finding new ways. Here's a top 10 links PowerPoint to assure you I don't long for the genocide of link monsters. Despite everything I've said, this video isn't a call to arms to tell Konami to delete links, even if it sounded like it. I don't believe a mechanic will ever outright be removed, no matter how much I hate links fundamentally. We're stuck with them. We're just living with the consequences of them now. That being said, it's not all doom and gloom for the game. It isn't fucking dying, well, not for the foreseeable future at least. Philharmonic is promising to me because even though they are generic link ones, they're balanced around you getting counters from playing the actual deck, making it so any monster in the deck can be used, but not any card in any deck can be used. So going forward, I think links utilizing older unexplored mechanics like counters as restrictions is a wonderful idea for balance. Something you've probably never heard in your life. I think the Amazonas pendulums are another good modern design application of pendulums within the actual archetype. A problem pendulum usually faces is the fact that they go to the grave if they're fused in hand. With the pendulum Amazonas, when you summon any Amazonas, they scale from grave. In other words, if you fuse them off in hand, they become scales, getting more value out of them. Well, I say value, but they have okay continuous effects. Give Amazonas a fusion destiny and a good fusion that uses the scales, then we'll be talking. I like Nemlaria as a concept. I like that we're realizing the fact that Pendulum's unique design can also be used to facilitate other forms of gameplay other than just pendulum summoning. Also, I'm not one to harp on official localization names, but Nemlaria and Voiceless Voice have gotta be the worst localizations. Nemuru, or Nemure in Japanese, refer to sleeping, so Nemu is an onomatopoeia for sleeping. So why the hell did you drop the U and call it a day? That shit means nothing in English, dog. I would've much preferred if they called her Snoozerella or Snorelia. I love Zar. I love that they printed a Sulfur Link 3 that just makes the Zark trap a free field nuke. This might be a little controversial, but I also like the super heavy pendulums. They're overdue for a deck that had a ton of room for pendulums to flush them out, but we only get 2 that do far too much, unfortunately being a generically exploitable engine. Although this card reads as a fucking apology for what they've done to Pendulum. And back to the subject of links. They actually made the new Magispector link, which gives me hope they'll actually try to diversify Pendulum decks, instead of telling them to just make Beyond and Prey. The new Fiendsmith archetype, or whatever it officially gets localized as, is a really cool use of links. making them all equipped from the grave so you can link them off and facilitate the deck's equip gimmick. We've also started to design cards that say you can't just OTK with access code. This deck is genuinely cool, and I hope it's one of those rare decks that are fun and good. In the end, there's room for links as a unique mechanic. More just has to be done to keep it in check. And while they may have been a mistake, if you just let me pen 6 regularly, all is forgiven.